Christianity and Reproductive Technologies, an introductory discussion. In this video, we'll be discussing various reproductive technologies and how they relate to Christianity, Christian ethics, and various biblical principles. The image shown here is of an egg being fertilized, two pronuclei, one from the egg, one from the sperm, with the pink blobs being the chromosomes from each pronuclei getting ready to merge. Why should we talk about reproductive technologies relative to Christianity? First, there are issues involved regarding the sanctity of human life and pro-life principles. So no matter what side of the pro-life, pro-choice debate you fall on, you may find some of the issues and controversies raised in this discussion, in this topic, to be interesting to you. There are important theological concepts that come into play when we discuss reproductive technologies. Some of those concepts are God's sovereignty, His providence, human freedom and human agency, as well as biblical normativity. We will discuss all of those in turn. There has also been recent political controversy, of course, with the Dobbs decision from the United States Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. That has certainly raised the issue in many people's minds. But also, more recently, in February of 2024, there was an Alabama Supreme Court decision involving IVF clinics. And there were some controversies involved with that decision, but also with how the Alabama legislature responded to that decision. We'll be talking about that shortly. Because of those recent political controversies, there was a resolution released from the recent Southern Baptist Convention held in 2024 in Indianapolis. So we will take a look at that, quite a detailed look at that. Another reason why we need to talk about this is in case you and your wife or you and your spouse are thinking about seeking reproductive assistance. Or even if you and your spouse are not seeking reproductive assistance, maybe someone you love is, and the material in this video can help provide some insight, hopefully allow you to provide some wise counsel to your loved ones who may be just starting out on the path of using these reproductive technologies. Before we begin, we need to define what we're talking about. What are reproductive technologies? Well, reproductive technologies are the application of conceptual knowledge and the compounds, practices, and tools such knowledge brings about to biological reproduction. Reproductive technology can be deployed in human as well as non-human reproduction. So the non-human reproduction or the use of reproductive technologies would be along the lines of animal husbandry, such as livestock and that type of thing, and making sure as many, say, cows become pregnant during the proper season as possible for the running of a livestock farm. Reproductive technology can be deployed to either aid reproduction or impede it, such as contraception impedes reproduction. Reproductive technology exists on a spectrum of intervention in the natural reproductive process. So there are some reproductive technologies that have quite a light hand that do not intervene in the natural process very much. And there are other reproductive technologies that pretty much take control of every step along the way in the process of human reproduction. I've tried to lay out some of the reproductive processes and reproductive technologies along this spectrum. First is just spontaneous natural intercourse. So this would be the physical sex act, nothing to aid or inhibit reproduction, just basic sexual intercourse. The next step along the spectrum of intervention would be something called natural family planning. Now, this isn't, this does not involve much high-tech science, but it does rely on knowledge and common everyday practices, the timing of intercourse. There are certain dietary interventions that might be used or natural supplements that can be used to aid in ovulation, preparation of the uterus, that type of thing. Next are various medicines that are involved in reproductive technologies. These medicines, some of them would be hormonal, others just more traditional medicines. They might aid ovulation. They may help improve the lining of the uterus, thereby making implantation of the fertilized egg more likely. So that is the next step in the spectrum of intervention. Surgery may come next. There are various types of surgeries that can be done to correct problems that may be inhibiting someone from getting pregnant. An example of this might be surgery to remove uterine fibroids that may be stopping the female from getting pregnant. And here we start getting involved in more of the high-tech or fairly intense intervention in the natural process. This one is called intrauterine or artificial insemination. Its abbreviation is IUI. This is done with the sperm of the husband or a donor sperm. I wanted to step through this process with you along with the next one, which is in vitro fertilization, so you can kind of understand the difference between these two things, because there are more moral implications in the IVF than there are in the IUI process. The first step is that the ovulation of the female is monitored, controlled with medicine and the timing of that medicine, and enhanced so that medicine or those hormones will cause the woman to ovulate to produce more than one follicle in a given month, typically. A semen sample is obtained from the male and is prepared, washed, that type of thing. That semen sample is inserted using some type of catheter or some type of equipment like that. The semen sample is inserted near the cervix or in the uterus by a doctor, but it is the husband's sperm, in the case of a married couple, going into the uterus or near the cervix of the wife. This is done at a certain time following along with the ovulation of the female. The sperm, just like after natural intercourse, swim to meet the egg in the fallopian tubes where, hopefully, fertilization occurs. Natural fertilization does occur, so this is just like natural intercourse. And then that typically happens in the fallopian tube. And then the fertilized egg descends down into the uterus and hopefully implants. So all of this in the IUI process is the same as the natural process, where the fertilization happens in the fallopian tubes and hopefully it descends down, the fertilized egg descends down into the uterus and is implanted, at which point the woman is pregnant and hopefully the pregnancy sustains itself and results in a live birth. So that is IUI. The next step that takes a little bit more control in the overall process is called in vitro fertilization. The abbreviation for that is IVF. That can be done with the egg and sperm of the wife or husband, or it can be a donor egg or donor sperm. In vitro fertilization gets its name. In vitro means in glass because, unlike IUI, where fertilization of the egg by the sperm occurs in the woman's fallopian tube, in IVF, the fertilization occurs in a petri dish or a test tube. It's not really a test tube anymore, but some medical device typically made of glass. That's what that's where in vitro fertilization gets its name from. I want to step through the process again with you here, noting the differences that it has with IUI. Much more control implemented here for in vitro fertilization. So medicine and hormones are given to enhance egg production in the female. Then there is a minor surgery. This is just an outpatient surgery. Surgery is done to extract multiple eggs or multiple follicles from the woman. A semen sample is obtained from the husband and is prepared. And then the semen sample is mixed with the eggs in a petri dish, for example. So individual sperms and individual eggs are not united artificially here. What happens is the follicles or the eggs are put in some type of container, let's say a petri dish, and then the semen sample is put in there as well. And in a sense, you let nature take over, because each sperm has its own job of finding an egg to fertilize. Some fertilized eggs are placed in the uterus. So various sperm will find an egg, fertilize it, and the doctors, after those fertilized eggs grow and the cells divide several times, some of the fertilized eggs / embryos are transferred to the woman's uterus. Natural implantation in the uterine lining would then occur. So that's, again, a natural process. The doctor is not able to force implantation in the lining of the uterus. It can place it in a spot conducive for that, but that does leave it up to nature for the fertilized egg or the embryo to implant in the uterus. And then finally, if there were more fertilized eggs created in the petri dish than which were transferred to the female, those remaining embryos can be frozen or they can be immediately destroyed. So oftentimes, because of the medications and hormones given to the female at the beginning of this process, multiple follicles, multiple eggs are produced and harvested. Let's say 10 are harvested. So those 10 are put in the petri dish with the semen sample. Let's say 7 of them actually do get fertilized successfully and start dividing. Well, you probably aren't going to put all 7 of the resulting embryos. You probably aren't going to transfer those to the female. You might transfer, say, 4 of them. You don't want to transfer all 7, because if all 7 were implanted and became successful pregnancies, you'd have 7 fetuses growing, which is not safe for the mother or for the fetuses. So you might implant, say, 4 of them fresh immediately from the petri dish, and then the remaining 3 you would freeze to hopefully use later after giving birth to any of the fetuses that survived or that were implanted and survived to the full term of the pregnancy. So there are various, you can begin to see here, some of the moral concerns with the IVF process, because embryos are frozen and they may actually be destroyed immediately, but even if they're frozen, they may be destroyed once they're frozen. So that is an ethical concern, given a pro-life perspective, that a human life begins at fertilization. We'll talk about those moral questions, those moral controversies as we go along. There is another process that's even has more intervention than even IVF. It is similar to IVF, but in this one, instead of just putting all of the harvested follicles or eggs from the woman and the semen sample from the man in a petri dish and allowing, in a sense, nature to take its course with fertilizing various eggs, here the doctor will select one egg and one sperm cell, a sperm cell that's much smaller than an egg, and force their combination. You may have seen this picture here in various articles or websites that talk about reproductive technologies. This is the process I'm describing. This process is referred to as intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Basically, it's saying through a small needle, one sperm cell is injected into one egg so that their genetic material can combine. So this is even a step further in intervention from the IVF process. Now, I'm going to include surrogacy here as within my spectrum of intervention. The only reason I'm including it here is because it does involve medicines and medical technology and the intervention of such. And it may involve the gametes from a third or fourth party. So that's why I'm throwing it in here at the end of the spectrum of intervention. Finally, I'm also going to throw in adoption here, even though the production of the child itself with its biological parents may have been through a completely natural process with no reproductive technologies involved, but I've included it here because it is somewhat similar to surrogacy, except that with adoption, the child has no genetic or conjugal links to either the mother or the father, the adoptive mother or adoptive father. So that's why I've thrown it into this spectrum of intervention here. So first, if we review this list of why we want to talk about this topic, I want to first talk about the recent political controversy, especially in Alabama, so we can begin to see some of the moral implications of, in this case, in vitro fertilization. In Alabama, three pairs of IVF parents sued their fertility clinic for wrongful death of their frozen embryos due to negligence, when another patient was able to remove them from cryostorage, leading to their death. So there were three married couples. They had pursued IVF, the IVF procedure. They had frozen embryos stored at the fertility clinic, and somehow the fertility clinic allowed another patient to access the freezing units, the freezer units where these embryos were being stored. And I'm not sure about what the intent, whether it was intentional or accidental, what that other patient did, but it resulted in the death of those frozen embryos. They thawed and so therefore died. They were being sued, or the clinic was being sued because they were negligent in allowing untrained people into the lab. In February of 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos qualify as quote-unquote children under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. So that was a state-level Alabama act called Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, and it was referring to the wrongful death of children. The Alabama Supreme Court, based on text that was actually in that law, said that it was clear that frozen embryos qualified as children under that Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. This ruling produced a chilling effect on in vitro procedures in Alabama due to increased liability of clinics and the now open question of their ability to purposefully destroy frozen embryos. So the Supreme Court said that this wrongful death of a minor act covered embryos, frozen embryos or fresh embryos. Well, if that's the case, then these in vitro fertilization clinics would not be able to destroy, say, frozen embryos. They could be ruled liable under the wrongful death of a minor act. So there was a chilling effect on reproductive technologies in Alabama until they figured out what was going on. Seeking to protect the availability of in vitro fertilization in the state of Alabama, the legislature passed a law to grant fertility clinics immunity from prosecution under that wrongful death law. So the legislature stepped in response to the Supreme Court, the Alabama Supreme Court's decision, and basically passed another law saying IVF clinics, fertility clinics are not subject to the wrongful death law. They are immune from prosecution. However, this exposed some pro-life legislatures to the charge of hypocrisy, since that immunity allowed clinics to continue to directly purposefully destroy frozen embryos. Alabama is a conservative state. The legislature is run by conservatives. Conservatives have a very large majority in the Alabama legislature. Many of those conservative legislators are pro-life. Well, this opened them up to the charge of hypocrisy, because basically they carved out an exception for fertility clinics to be able to destroy frozen embryos, which seemingly, or at least in many people's minds, violates their pro-life stance. If an embryo implanted in a woman's uterus cannot intentionally be killed, according to pro-life principles, why can an identical embryo that is either frozen or unfrozen outside a woman's body be destroyed? That is the question that the action of the Alabama state legislature raised. It was quite controversial. In time, the legislature may go in and amend what they did, reverse what they did, and find some other solution to the problem. Well, in response to this, or because of the heightened scrutiny that this case in Alabama raised in the pro-life community, the Southern Baptist Convention, in their national convention in 2024 that was held in Indianapolis, actually passed a resolution concerning in vitro fertilization. They wanted to clarify what their position was on it. This resolution is non-binding. That's the way the Southern Baptist Church works. It is non-binding on any church or on any Southern Baptist Christian. But it just reflects the judgment of those people that were at the Southern Baptist Convention. I want to talk a bit about this resolution. First, you may have heard on TV, in the news, online, some rather dramatic statements about this resolution. Southern Baptists pass resolution formally opposing IVF. Southern Baptists vote against the use of IVF. These all seem pretty cut and dry, as if the Southern Baptist Convention was saying absolutely no to any uses of in vitro fertilization. Now, this resolution did not cover other types of reproductive technologies such as IUI and things such as that. It was limited to IVF, or at least the main resolution was limited to IVF. So my question is, was this the right call from a Christian perspective, from an evangelical perspective? Was this the right call to basically say that IVF is off limit due to its moral concerns? Here is a copy of the complete resolution. It's about 2 pages long. The first half, or 60%, is just a series of whereas statements, basically where they're making statements of fact that will relate to the bottom third or the bottom 40% of the resolution where actually resolved statements are made. I'm going to highlight the two areas in pink. The first one, the resolved statement in pink. I know you can't read it. I'll enlarge it in a few minutes here, but I'm going to be addressing that. That's the core resolution referring to IVF and calling on Southern Baptists not to utilize it. But I also want to talk about one of those whereas statements at the beginning, also highlighted in pink. We'll talk about that in turn, because that seems to bring in the idea of biblical normativity, especially normativity regarding human reproduction. And I think there are some interesting things to discuss there, interesting theological considerations. So the main resolution, or the main part of the overall resolution that I want to talk about, is shown here. I'll read it. Resolved that the messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana, June 11th through 12th, 2024, call on Southern Baptists to reaffirm the unconditional value and right to life of every human being, including those in an embryonic stage, and this is the important part, to only utilize reproductive technologies consistent with that affirmation. So this is the important part. They are calling on Southern Baptists to only utilize reproductive technologies that are consistent with the affirmation of the unconditional value and right to life of every human being, including embryos. Does this resolution oppose the use of IVF altogether? Is this a blanket condemnation or a blanket call to all Southern Baptists to avoid IVF altogether? Well, it's not really clear. This underlined portion can be read in a couple of different ways. One way is to say they call on Southern Baptists to only utilize reproductive technologies which are always employed by everyone in ways that are consistent with that affirmation. If that's the way you read this resolution, then it would seem to call for a blanket opposition to all IVF procedures. But there's another way you can read this, the underlined portion. Should it be read as only utilize reproductive technologies in ways that are consistent with that affirmation? If you read it that way, then it could be that you could employ various technologies that are involved in vitro fertilization and not run afoul of any moral principles or any Christian ethical concerns. For example, and we'll discuss more of these details later, for example, can you do IVF as long as you don't destroy any frozen embryos? Seems like that's the main core problem, the core moral implication or the moral controversy within IVF is the destruction of frozen embryos. Well, if you don't do that, would it be permissible to pursue the overall IVF process? We will talk about that. If you look at some of the media that came after this resolution was passed by the Southern Baptist Convention, it does turn out that the authors and backers of the SBC resolution intended it to oppose the use of IVF altogether. Albert Mohler, who I respect tremendously, he wrote the resolution and he was a primary backer of the resolution. In an article that you can find on his website, and also in a Wall Street Journal article that he wrote, he said here at the bottom, if the Southern Baptist Convention adopted a resolution opposing the use of in vitro fertilization. That's his characterization of what happened with what the resolution meant. And then again, in another paper, He wrote, "We must oppose the use of these technologies by those who would subvert the family, the marital covenant, and the Creator's gift of sexual union and procreation." So again, it seems as though the author of the resolution and the backers of the resolution do intend for it to be taken as opposing IVF altogether. Whether that is necessary based on the Christian faith or Christian ethics, we'll discuss in the remaining part of this video. And the main question we need to answer is this stance required by Christian ethics? So if you read the entire resolution, all of the whereas statements, as well as all of the resolve statements, you will find the following concerns that were addressed in the Southern Baptist Convention resolution. The first and the primary concern is the destruction of unwanted embryos. These unwanted embryos would be either frozen embryos that were being saved potentially for being transferred into the woman for subsequent pregnancies. But it can also be the destruction of unwanted embryos, really fetuses at that time, called selective reduction. So as part of IVF, depending on the number of fertilized eggs that you transfer to the female, you may get too many of those fertilized eggs implanted into the uterus and then grow and at some point become fetuses. And if you have too many, it is unsafe. It can be deadly for the mother and, of course, for the fetuses. So what it might be common in that case, depending on the parties involved, would be to do something called selective reduction. That's where essentially if you've got, say, 5 fetuses in the uterus of the pregnant woman, you might go in and selectively reduce 3 of them. So you actually go and perform an abortion to kill 3 of the fetuses, leaving 2 fetuses, which would be safe for the mother and safe for the fetuses, and they can continue to develop in the uterus and hopefully be born several months later. So that's called selective reduction. That is a part of the IVF process in many cases, although it does not have to be, and we'll talk about how to avoid that later on. That's the primary concern, the primary moral issue involved. But there are other concerns that are raised in the resolution. Another one is the perpetual and large-scale cryo storage of embryos. By some estimates, there are 1 million embryos frozen in the United States right now, around 600,000 to 1 million, and it just grows every year. Some of these embryos will never be thawed to be transferred to their mother's womb again. And so the question is, how long do we leave these embryos frozen in that state? At some point, you have too many embryos and there's not enough room to store all of them. So the question is, are we just going to destroy them at some point? So of course that has moral implications. Also, because fertilization occurs outside the womb, it occurs, say, in a petri dish, there is a possibility for genetic sorting and genetic modification. Genetic sorting would be looking at the petri dish a few days after the semen has been put in with it. Look a few days later, see how many eggs were successfully fertilized and have started to multiply cells, to have cells divide and multiply. You can, at that point, do some genetic testing and start sorting and saying, well, of these, let's say 10 again were created, these 6 have good genetics, whether genetics as far as health goes and genetics say that they're not susceptible to breast cancer or something like that. Or you could even get to the point where you sort them based on if they're male or female. Or eventually you could even start testing them for other things like hair color, height, weight, those types of things. And then you could prioritize those. There are ethical concerns with doing so, especially if it means that the other embryos that don't pass the test get destroyed. And then also the idea of genetic modification. Since the embryos are in the petri dish, genetic modifications can be done, especially more so going into the future. So there are the typical ethical concerns with genetic modifications of human beings as well. There's potential for experimentation on embryos, for example, obtaining stem cells from them. So because the embryos are in the petri dish, they're easily available. And let's say 4 of them aren't going to be transferred to the woman and they're not going to be frozen, they could be seen as sources of stem cells or other types of science experiments, which of course means that they will die. So again, these are ethical concerns with experimentation on embryos and the collection of stem cells. Another concern among some traditional or conservative Christians, or people of other faiths for that matter, is that these embryos, say embryos that are frozen, can be adopted by other couples that have fertility problems. That's not an issue in and of itself, but for some Christians, it would be problematic, say, if 2 women wanted to adopt a frozen embryo, or 2 men, married or not, wanting to adopt a frozen embryo. So there are questions around that. Another issue is that it potentially introduces a third or even a fourth party into the marital union. So the idea here is that IVF, as well as IUI, may use, say, donor sperm. It could be that the husband has some defect with his sperm, something with the morphology of the sperm or the motility of the sperm, which would make impregnation or fertilization impossible. So you have to obtain sperm from a sperm donor. Well, that brings, in a sense, a third person into the marital union. Or you could even have a donor egg and donor sperm. So that would be a third and a fourth person. And the donor egg and donor sperm can be combined in a petri dish and then transferred to the mother. Well, that brings additional parties into the marital union. We'll discuss whether those are major concerns or not. And then finally, we hinted at this earlier, but some Christians see the IVF process as a violation of the normative biblical model of procreation resulting from the embodied union of husband and wife. So this, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, what is described there as a male and a female, that's a male and a female body being created and then being told to multiply and to be fruitful by the coming togethers of their body. That's the embodied union, resulting in children. So the question is that normative? Does that passage indicate that that's the way God wants it to be, the only way God wants children created? Or is it just saying that happened to be the way it was at that time? We'll discuss that toward the end of this video. Before I get into all of these, the issues raised by the Southern Baptist Convention resolution, I did want to talk about our story. This is my family. I've blurred out the faces of my wife and 3 children, and this was a while ago. I do not look like this now. My children are all in their 20s now. But I wanted to tell you our story because we did use reproductive technologies to complete our family. Our first child was born completely naturally and unassisted through any technologies. That's the child on the bottom right-hand corner of that picture, completely natural. Planned, we had decided to start trying to have a child, but no technologies were used. After a while of trying for our second child and with no success, we did pursue some assistance. Eventually, we relied on the IUI process, intrauterine insemination process, and the result was our second child, who is the blonde girl there on the far left. We tried again for another child after that with no success. So we eventually resorted to in vitro fertilization, and we were fortunate enough, blessed enough, to get our third child through in vitro fertilization. That's the little boy there in the middle. So that is how we achieved our family, our three beautiful children. And that's why I'm so interested in this topic. That's why I was very interested in what the Southern Baptist Convention had to say about it. Not only did my wife and I utilize reproductive technologies to complete our family, but we currently attend a Southern Baptist church. But I do want to say that you can feel free to push back against what I'm saying. If you disagree with my analysis of the ethical appropriateness of using reproductive technologies, certainly do so. We're not going to be offended. I make this statement for when I present this material to a live audience, so that if there's feedback, if there's questions, they can feel free to push back against what we're saying, and we're not going to be offended. I did want to say about our story, our dealing with and overcoming infertility problems, that it was a very difficult and dark time lasting almost 10 years. More so for my wife, but also for me as we were trying to have additional children. It's very difficult. We went through a lot of pain and suffering and disappointments, poking and prodding and testing, daily injections, sometimes daily appointments at the doctor's office for periods of time. We'd have cycles of hope and then false hope and then hopelessness, wild hormone swings because of the different hormone injections we were taking, say for augmenting the creation of eggs or follicles. We'd have crushing disappointment when we take our pregnancy test every month and it came back negative. We did seek counseling as a couple, and my wife individually as well. We had, we're not proud of it, but we are human, bouts of jealousy and bitterness. I think among family and friends during this time when we were seeking fertility, during this one time, I think when we were trying for child number 2, I think between family and friends, we had like 20 pregnancies. And so we didn't deal with that the best way, but it's real. And I think a lot of people going through this fertility process experience the same thing. It also leads to us questioning God. And for my wife, it led to a lot of retail therapy. But I just say that to say that, as you come across people that are dealing with fertility struggles, whether they're pursuing reproductive technologies or not, to be sensitive, to not ask people, when are you going to get pregnant again? Or when are you going to get pregnant the first time? Just to be sensitive about where people are would be a blessing to them. If you could reach out and kind of walk alongside them during this process, that would mean even more. So I wanted to share with you some of the principles and practices that we relied on while we were embarking on our reproductive technologies journey. First of all, the overriding principle was a pro-life principle. We decided that all fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses are living human beings and God's image bearers. Therefore, their life is to be valued and protected. We used that principle to decide what we would do and would not do as part of our engagement with reproductive technologies, as part of our fertility struggle and trying to overcome that. And I want to discuss these with you. They're going to come into play further down the line when we look at the details of the Southern Baptist Convention resolution. First and foremost, we did consider the relative implantation success rates of in vitro versus natural unassisted reproduction. The idea here is that if we were going to do IVF, which of course involved the transfer of fertilized eggs or embryos into the uterus, that the embryos had, quote unquote, a fighting chance of successfully implanting. And by fighting chance, we compared those rates to the rates of natural implantation through natural reproduction without any assistance of reproductive technologies. It turns out they're roughly similar. That was important to us. If it had turned out, say, that with natural unassisted reproduction, that say 90% of fertilized eggs, once they get to the uterus, do successfully implant into the uterine lining, and IVF embryos, once transferred, say only 2% of those were successfully implanted. Basically, doing IVF and transferring the embryos would be basically a death sentence relative to the natural process. But because they're roughly in the same ballpark, we considered it an ethical practice to pursue. Another thing we did up front was we decided to limit the number of eggs that were going to be fertilized. So we harvested a certain number of eggs or follicles from my wife and placed them in the Petri dish with the semen sample. But we limited that number. The reason is we didn't want to have, 48 embryos out there developing. And so we did limit the number of eggs to fertilize to something reasonable that we knew we were either immediately or a little bit down the road, we're going to transfer to Jennifer, to my wife, at some point. We only implanted a safe number of fresh embryos. So when her eggs were placed in the Petri dish with my semen sample and natural fertilization occurred, we only took a subset of those that were successfully reproducing or having their cells divide. We didn't want to put a large number into the uterus. That's because, like we mentioned earlier about selective reductions, we didn't want to have, say, 8 fetuses growing. Now, chances are that wouldn't have happened, but there's always that outside chance. We didn't want to do that because that would require selective reduction of fetuses, meaning you would go in and abort some of the fetuses in order to save the life of the mother and the life of the fetuses as well. So we limited the number of embryos that we transferred to my wife so as not to, what I call, paint ourselves into a moral corner. We wanted to avoid that choice going forward, or the decision we would have to make going forward about selective reduction, because according to our pro-life principle, that was not permitted. So we didn't allow that situation to come to pass by limiting the number of fresh embryos transferred to my wife's uterus. We also, in the same way, committed to no selective reductions. That goes hand in hand with the previous commitment to only transfer a safe number of fresh embryos. We would not do selective reductions. We did freeze the remaining embryos. We did not immediately destroy any. We froze them all, and there was never any intention to destroy them or to donate them to science, or really even to adopt them out once they were frozen. That is because we were committed to thawing all frozen embryos for future implantation, which we eventually did do. And for those that were thawed, the commitment was to only transfer a safe number of thawed embryos at a time as well. Again, this is done to avoid the need for selective reductions. So those are what I call our principle and practices that we employed for in vitro fertilization. I think this allowed us to use IVF procedures and practices and technology in a way that I think is moral and ethical and according to Christian principles. So the question is, did these principles and practices avoid the moral hazards of using IVF. I maintain that they, in fact, do, that they enabled us to utilize in vitro fertilization technologies and still maintain our ethical, moral, and religious principles. We'll see that through the remainder of this video. So let's review again this list of the concerns regarding IVF that were expressed in the Southern Baptist Resolution. Over the next few minutes, I want to go through each of these concerns and address them on whether they are legitimately concerns, and if they are, how they can be avoided or addressed depending on how you employ IVF or any other reproductive technologies. Of course, the first concern, the primary concern, as we discussed previously, was the destruction of unwanted embryos, whether through selective reduction, which is abortion of some of the fetuses, or through destruction, direct destruction of frozen embryos. Our IVF principles and practices avoided, by design, the intentional destruction of any embryo or fetus, fresh or frozen, outside or inside the uterus. So, no fresh embryos were destroyed in the petri dish, no frozen embryos were destroyed, all were transferred, and no embryos or fetuses were selectively reduced. In addition, before pursuing the IVF option, we ensured that implantation success rates were roughly in line with natural reproduction. Let's look at another concern that was found in the SBC resolution. They were concerned with the perpetual and large-scale cryo storage of embryos. Again, you remember that there are anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million frozen embryos in the United States, so that's quite a large number. This indefinite cryo storage of embryos at such scale is of concern. As we did, if this is a concern, couples should consider only creating the number of fertilized eggs they are willing to eventually implant. Although this can be financially inefficient, but in this way, they won't add to the increasing stockpile of frozen embryos. In fact, we do not have any frozen embryos in storage at this point. We utilized them all, transferred them all to my wife's uterus. Couples should also make a backup plan for frozen embryos for unseen circumstances, say the death of the couple in a car accident or something. Well, what's going to happen to those embryos? They could be adopted out. Someone in the family could implant them to bring those children to a full and successful term, that type of thing. Frozen embryos not to be implanted in the mother can be adopted by other couples struggling with infertility. That's a quite common practice, although it could certainly increase in number. There is what's called the Snowflakes program. The organization that handles that or participates in that type of adoption is called Nightlight Christian Adoptions. So for couples that have struggled with fertility, have pursued various reproductive technologies, or as many as they are comfortable with, they still may not have been able to get pregnant. So this does indeed offer another alternative to adopt a frozen embryo and have it implanted into the female. And Christians, I think, everywhere ought to consider supporting laws and policies that make it easier, less expensive, and less risky to adopt frozen embryos. In this way, we can avoid the ever-increasing stockpile of frozen embryos in this country. If we take the next three concerns that were expressed in the Southern Baptist Convention resolution together, they are the possibility of genetic sorting of embryos. Think of embryos in the petri dish. There is a possibility of genetic sorting and modification. That means you can do genetic testing on different embryos and see which ones are quote unquote better than the other ones. That could be better, meaning that they're less susceptible to certain diseases, say breast cancer, or that they have physical attributes that the parents want. They'll be tall, they won't be prone to being overweight, or they may be intelligent, those types of things. There is also the possibility, especially going into the future, for genetic modification. This would happen to actually go into the chromosomes, into the genes, and do certain modification to either fix a problem, which may not be morally suspect, but you could also do things to augment capabilities of the embryo itself. The overriding concern morally and ethically here is, especially on the sorting side, you may do the genetic testing of all, say 10 embryos, and only found that 4 had all of the attributes you wanted. Some of those attributes may not even be related to health. Let's say they were all genetically predestined to be tall or good looking or intelligent or blonde or whatever. And then the remaining embryos would be maybe destroyed or something along those lines. So that's the moral concern there. The next concern is the potential for experimentation on embryos. An example are obtaining stem cells from embryos, which would kill the embryo. So if an embryo is not wanted, either because of genetic sorting or any other reason, it does open up the possibility of experimentation on the embryos, which is just another way of bringing about their death, having those types of experiments performed on them. And for some Christians, it is a concern that some of these embryos can be adopted by couples that are outside of the male-female paradigm for marriages. So that would be a problematic for some Christians. For other Christians, it is not a problem, but that is a concern that was expressed in the SBC resolution. Again, our principles and practices avoided all of these concerns because we limited the number of embryos created and were committed to transferring all embryos to my wife. We did not have any sorting done because we were going to transfer all embryos regardless of their genetics. We did not have any genetic modifications done to our embryos. We did not allow any experimentation to be done on our embryos, and since we were committed to transferring all embryos, we did not donate any of them to scientific research. In the same way, since we were committed to transferring all embryos, there were no leftover embryos to be adopted by anyone. I think that fully addresses those concerns. The next concern in the SBC resolution is the introduction of third and fourth parties into the marital union. This concern centers on using donor eggs and/or donor sperm from third and fourth parties in the IVF process. The concern is that bringing an additional party or parties into the marriage somehow undermines that marriage. We were able to avoid this concern as we only used eggs from my wife and my own sperm. However, some couples may have eggs and/or sperm that are defective in some way and so cannot be used in IVF. They would then need to utilize donor eggs and/or donor sperm. But even for those couples that would have to use donor eggs or donor sperm, would this necessarily undermine their marriage? When a mother, consider a mother that was married and had some young children, but she was either widowed or divorced for just cause, when that mother remarries, does the fact that the child is genetically and conjugally related to the mother, but not to the husband, undermine the marriage? I don't think it does. Similarly, when a couple adopts a child, does the fact that the child shares no genetics or conjugality with either parent, would that undermine the marriage? Again, I don't think it does. There are instances in the Bible of essentially using donor eggs to have a child, surrogacy involving physical sex with a third party. We'll look at an example of that later on in this video. And regarding donor sperm, Levirate marriages in ancient Israel have similarities to sperm donation to create a descendant for a deceased brother who died childless. So in Levirate marriages, if your brother dies and he did not have children with his wife, you are obligated, although you can decline, but generally it's expected that you would marry the widow of your dead brother so that you could provide an heir for your brother to carry on the line. This practice did have benefits to the widow for someone to take care of her, but the primary purpose was to provide a descendant for your dead brother. It's also important to realize here that since the first husband has died, this example does not directly apply to the concern of quote-unquote undermining a marriage, but there are some interesting aspects that are similar to sperm donation within an IVF context. Finally, the last concern that was raised in the SBC resolution is the violation of the normative biblical model of procreation resulting from the embodied union of husband and wife. So basically, this is saying that the embodied union, the physical sex act between a husband and wife, is the way, the only way that God wants human reproduction to occur. Before we continue on talking about normativity, don't forget to subscribe, set your notifications, like, share, and comment on this video. Again, back to the normative biblical model. And, this idea of normativity in the Bible applies to lots of areas besides just human reproduction. The idea of biblical normativity kind of has a couple of different senses. And we're going to look at those two possible senses in a second here. But I wanted to show you in the SBC resolution where this biblical normativity is hinted at. It is in one of the whereas statements at the top half of the resolution. It says, whereas biblical creation order, that's the Genesis story, portrays the embodied union of husband and wife as the singular normative expression for procreation. And the scriptural reference they have for that is Genesis 1, verses 27 to 28. Those verses read like this. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. So we see two things here. The mentioning of the male and female is the hinting at the embodied union, the physical sex act. That's what the male and female is getting at. That's what the male and female words refer to, the sexual distinctions between the two sexes, male and female. So that's where the embodied union comes into play. And then when God tells the human couple to be fruitful and multiply, this is talking about, of course, human reproduction. So the people who wrote this resolution, the people who backed the resolution, seem to see here this connection between this bodily union, embodied union, and human reproduction. So that's their idea of biblical normativity. But like I said, there are a couple different senses of normativity. Number one is it descriptive or prescriptive? Is it merely describing what the case is? And this applies to lots of areas of biblical interpretation and understanding. Is it merely describing the way things work, or is it prescriptive, meaning this is the way it should work? So one is just kind of stating a fact of how things are, and the other sense of normativity is this is the way it should be, this is the way God wants it to be. So the two different senses can be, well, this is the way it is versus this is the way it should be. This is the way God wants it to be. It seems like the authors and backers of the SBC resolution employed the idea of normative to mean the way it should be. That is the second sense of normativity. You can see that on the article on the Albert Mohler's website. He says, children are not the products of a technological process like common consumer commodities, but they are the gift of a loving God whose intention, so that word heavily brings in the idea of it should be this way, whose intention is that the children should be born to a man and woman united in the bond of marriage, and as the fruit of that marital bond, that's the physical sex act, realized in the conjugal act. So it does seem here that they understand the Genesis chapter 1, couple of verses we read earlier, to be normative in the sense that the Bible, those verses, is saying this is the way it should be. It wasn't just describing the way things happened at the time of creation. Is this the proper reading of the biblical text? I do not believe it is, and it risks putting words into God's mouth. I think the more natural reading of Genesis 1 is that he was merely describing at that point in time how reproduction was to occur. He was not looking thousands of years down the line and saying, oh, by the way, these new technologies need to be avoided under all circumstances. So I think that is putting words into God's mouth, reading normativity, to take those verses to say that human reproduction should only be this way. In a sense, within the context of reproduction, the egg is the essence of the female and the sperm is the essence of the male. Gametes actually define male versus female. So their union at fertilization is the union of male and female as described in the Bible. But even beyond that, if physical union of husband and wife is the one way reproduction should occur, according to the Bible, then consistency would require that intrauterine or artificial insemination, that's IUI, ICSI, which is where one sperm gets injected into one egg, gamete donation, and surrogacy would be opposed as well. Now, I don't doubt that the authors and backers of the resolution would indeed oppose ICSI and gamete donation and surrogacy, but they are kind of quiet on intrauterine insemination. That avoids bodily union, physical union between man and wife in order to get pregnant, because it takes the semen sample from the man, prepares it, and then inserts it through a catheter to the female cervix or uterus. For natural fertilization to occur in the fallopian tubes. Well, that does not involve a physical union, a conjugal act, so they would have to be against IUI as well. They may be, they may not be. They have not said as part of the resolution. If the one way it should be involves a very strong link between physical union and reproduction, consistency would require that contraception be rejected as illicit as well. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is against contraception. My sense is most Protestants, most evangelicals, do accept contraception as ethical. Certainly, there is a large portion that does not, but I think the majority of evangelicals and Protestants do accept the morality of contraception. But contraception does break the link between the embodied union, which is the physical union, the physical sex act, and reproduction. That's the whole point of contraception, to break that link so that the physical union can be enjoyed without risk or reduced risk of reproduction or pregnancy. So I think the backers and the authors of the SBC resolution really need to consider this strong link between physical union and reproduction because it cuts both ways. It seems to me consistency would require that they oppose contraception as well. One word on Catholic teaching. I'm not an expert on Catholic teaching in this area. I do know that they oppose generally surrogacy, advanced reproductive technologies such as IUI and IUF, and they also oppose contraception, I believe, in most instances. Catholic teaching, based on its philosophical heritage and commitments, is consistent in the logic I've laid out here. I respect their philosophy and natural law reasoning in this area. They have a strong foundation in philosophy and also in natural law reasoning. And from that foundation, I can see how it naturally comes to be that they would oppose reproductive technologies, oppose surrogacy, and oppose contraception. But that is not a case that I see on the Protestant or the evangelical side of things. So again, looking at all of the concerns that were expressed in the Southern Baptist Convention resolution, I think we've addressed all of them, especially looking at the principles and the practices that we ourselves employed during our use of both IUI and IVF. These principles and practices that we employed, I believe, address all of the concerns in the SBC resolution. They avoid all moral pitfalls, and they allowed us to pursue those or utilize those technologies in an ethical, a moral, and a Christian manner. One other thing that we should discuss that's related to everything we've discussed up to this point is the idea of divine sovereignty versus human agency. Now, this is a topic, a subject that is much broader, of course, than this video. It applies to just about every area of life. It is a big theological conundrum in many ways. There are many different ways to address it, many different systems, many different frameworks. But I want to talk a little bit about that here relative to fertility and infertility, and what are the causes of infertility, and to what lengths is a Christian permitted to try to overcome infertility using various practices or technologies. A few things that the Bible says about this area is, number one, children are indeed a blessing. There's no doubt about that. God in the scripture, especially in the Old Testament, is often portrayed as actively and directly managing fertility and infertility. He is shown as, quote unquote, opening and closing wombs. This seemingly makes human reproduction a special area of direct divine determinism, or some people might just call it providence. So these passages, primarily in the Old Testament, talking about God opening and closing wombs, because it involves the area of human reproduction, the creation of a brand new human who is an image bearer of God, that this is a special area that God controls uniquely, directly, and deterministically, and we ought not work against what he has opened or what he has closed. This makes the area of human reproduction sacrosanct. You cannot touch it. You cannot go to extreme lengths to get pregnant if the natural way of embodied union doesn't work. That means that God has closed the womb. You cannot use contraception because that stops the effect of God opening the womb. So it makes human reproduction sacrosanct. It is a special area of nature that we cannot touch. But that leaves other areas of human health and flourishing as legitimate areas of human technological intervention. So you think of other medical interventions for cancer or for a neurological disease. Those are areas where it is proper, it is acceptable to employ human knowledge and human technology to address those defects. While most Christians accept medical or technological interventions in the area of human health and flourishing, examples are fixing a cleft palate when a child is born, treating cancer, using technology to increase crop yields, many reject medical or technological interventions in human reproduction because it is seemingly a special area of direct divine control. But the Bible depicts God as also controlling human health and flourishing. For example, regarding the human disasters of famine, drought, and floods, the Bible says in Job, "If he withholds the waters, they dry up," meaning if he withholds the rain, famine is brought about, drought is brought about. If he sends them out, meaning the rain, they overwhelm the land, meaning that the floods will come, devastating floods. Given God's divine sovereignty over all aspects of human health and flourishing, including famine, drought, and floods, is it therefore wrong to deploy human knowledge and technology to avoid or overcome famine, droughts, and floods? It would seem it is not improper to do so. It seems actually that it is the right thing to do, and we should pursue and expand ways that we can address these defects, address these problems with human health and flourishing with increased knowledge and innovative technologies. Therefore, given that infertility most often is the result of disease or dysfunction acting against human health and flourishing, it is also permissible to deploy human knowledge and technology in the area of human reproduction without being rebellious toward the sovereignty of God. But that use of reproductive technologies must still be employed within carefully drawn ethical boundaries, as discussed previously when we discussed the principles and practices we employed when we used those reproductive technologies. There are still limits, but the limits that were part of the SBC resolution, I think, were not the proper limits. They were too narrowly drawn. I'd like to talk now about the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel as it applies directly to what we've been discussing about the Christian, the intersection of Christianity and reproductive technologies. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, but was tricked by their father into marrying Leah first. So he married Leah. 7 years later, he married Rachel. Leah and Rachel each had a female servant named Zilpah and Bilhah, respectively. While Rachel was more loved by Jacob, she was the one that Jacob wanted originally, she initially was unable to have children. That was a huge deal in that culture. One of the wife's highest priorities was to provide a child for her husband, and especially a son. There was a lot of shame and guilt involved if a woman was not able to do so. Rachel's fertility struggles are recounted in Genesis 29 and 30. Initially, Leah bore 4 sons to Jacob. Rachel, of course, envied Leah and begged Jacob to give her a child. Jacob asks, "Am I God who has withheld children from you?" So his response to Rachel is one of those verses in the Old Testament that I was referring to earlier that portrayed God as being deterministically and directly involved with the opening and closing of wombs. Rachel seeks to have children through what is essentially what we would call today was a surrogate, her servant Bilhah. Bilhah did have 2 sons with Jacob as part of this plan by Rachel to have children, but these children were in a very significant sense considered children of Rachel's. She counted them as her own children and was even the one to name them. Perhaps to one-up Rachel, Leah, who seemed at this point to have ceased bearing children, had her servant be a surrogate too, producing 2 more sons for Jacob. Rachel, at this point, ever more desperate, exchanges Leah's mandrake for permission to Leah to lay with Jacob that night. Mandrake was a plant thought to have fertility-enhancing properties. So Rachel is desperate to get pregnant. Leah had obtained some mandrake. I think her oldest son, Reuben, is the one that found it out in the field, brought it to Leah. She had it. Rachel wanted to use it to help her get pregnant. And as payment for the mandrake, Rachel gave Leah permission to sleep with Jacob that night. Well, how did that plan work out? Actually, that night, Leah conceived her 5th son to Jacob. So that whole plan kind of backfired on Rachel there. Leah had a 5th son, and she also, subsequent to that, gave birth to a 6th son to Jacob. All this time, Rachel has been unable to bear children. There are 3 women involved with Jacob, and among them, they have had 10 sons. Rachel's shame and guilt is ever increasing. Her desperation is increasing through all of this. And then the Bible says, then God remembered Rachel and opened her womb, and Rachel bore a son, Jacob's 11th, the great Joseph. She later bore another son, Benjamin, which was Jacob's 12th. So you see here how the 12 sons of Jacob, which eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel, came to be. Levi, one of the sons of Leah, did not become a tribe because they were the priestly class. But Joseph was not a tribe either. Instead, each of his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became tribes. So that totals up to the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Through all of this, it is said of God, He opens a womb while others are barren. He withholds the fruit of the womb. God judges and hears the voice of those seeking children. He gives children as wages. He endows with children. He remembers those seeking children, and they have children. He takes away reproach via childbearing. We see pronouncements of God's active involvement, His direct and deterministic sovereignty. But in this story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, we also see human agency throughout. We see humans taking action. We see humans making free will decisions. They take actions. They seek out surrogates. They seek out medical preparations to help them overcome their infertility. These 2 things, God's sovereignty and human agency, are not exclusive of one another. God's sovereignty and providence integrate with human freedom and agency in some theological frameworks. For example, the framework of divine middle knowledge. I want to take a minute here to talk about divine middle knowledge. Many people may not be familiar with this. This is just a 30,000-foot overview. First, we have the primary type of God's knowledge called God's natural knowledge. God's natural knowledge is knowledge of everything that could happen, anything that's logically possible to happen in a world filled with various creatures. So these are all things that could theoretically happen, anything that's logically possible to happen. The next type of knowledge, which is called God's middle knowledge, is God's knowledge of everything that would happen. So this is a difference between everything that could happen and everything that would happen. The concept of would incorporates human libertarian free will decisions and agency. So, for example, this middle knowledge says that Susie, given her constitution up to that point, God knows through middle knowledge what Susie would do in a certain circumstance, what she would freely do, not what she was determined to do or what she had to do, but based on her constitution and the circumstances, what would she freely do? God knows that. That is his middle knowledge. Some people refer to it as a knowledge of counterfactuals or of contingencies. It is at this point, and we're talking about the logical moments of God's knowledge relative to his decree to create the world. These are logical moments. These aren't necessarily sequential, or I guess I should say temporal moments. But at this point, God would decree to create the world that we inhabit today. And based on that creation decree, God has free knowledge, everything that will happen. So that is derived from God's middle knowledge because he creates a specific world out of all the would things that could happen, or would happen, I should say. He knows everything that will happen in this world that he did create based on that middle knowledge. But just because he knows it will happen does not mean that it had to deterministically happen. It still incorporates human libertarian free will decisions. There's much more that can be said on this. Not all theologians and scholars agree with this framework. I think it is quite powerful in what it explains. There is biblical warrant for understanding things in this way and building the framework in this way, but there's a lot more to be said about this. But for now, this will have to do. Like I said, that this framework is centered on God's middle knowledge. It's referred to as Molinism. I've been referring to it as God's middle knowledge. You may hear of Molinism. That's essentially the same thing. And there are different aspects, different types of Molinism. It falls along a spectrum, just like every other framework, it seems, in theology. It resolves apparent incompatibilities between concepts of divine sovereignty, determinism, and providence versus human libertarian free will decisions and agency and responsibility. There are multiple nuanced aspects of Molinism that remain unexplored in this short treatment. We just do not have the time here. Maybe I will pull together a future pull together information regarding this topic and create a future video, or more than likely a series of videos on this topic. Let me know in the comments if that is something you'd be interested in learning more about. Not all Christian scholars, like I said, agree with this framework. They have other frameworks that they propose that they think resolve the incompatibilities between divine sovereignty and human free will decisions. One last thing before we wrap things up. As I was researching this topic, I've been surprised to learn that some traditional evangelical Christians who would describe themselves as pro-life make moral distinctions between a 2-week embryo, a 2-week-old embryo versus a 7-month-old fetus. Or they might make distinctions between an embryo in the uterus and an embryo outside the uterus, whether it's frozen or not. I've come across some evangelicals who somewhat, not to say too much, but shrug their shoulders at the idea of a frozen embryo being destroyed. They don't seem to think that that is a big deal per se, even though they're pro-life in the sense that they don't think a 7-month-old fetus, the death, the abortion of a 7-month-old fetus is morally permissible. So they draw distinctions there. I was quite surprised to learn that from many people in my circles that was their viewpoint. These distinctions seem to be based on an initial moral intuition. They look at a clump of cells that looks nothing like a human, say a 2-week embryo, and say, well, that doesn't look human. I don't have this connection to it. What is its moral status? But they look at a 7-month-old fetus and they're like, well, that's just like a baby. I know killing babies is wrong, but this clump of cells over here, this thing that doesn't even look human. So it creates in their minds this moral intuition that the destruction of an embryo is less significant, and you might say even less ethically or morally problematic than the destruction of a 7-month-old fetus. Now, I appreciate and I value the role of moral intuition and moral reasoning. I think this is supported biblically. The primary place where this is addressed is in Romans 2, verses 12 through 16, but it's also present in many other places in the Old Testament and New Testament. This idea that God has given humanity moral intuition and given us the faculty of moral reasoning. We can't just rely on an explicit verse here, here, and here, because those verses are never going to apply to every situation. So he has given us these moral skills, moral intuition and moral reasoning, to understand the principles, the values behind some of these verses about do this and don't do this, and how to extend them, how to find their essence, and how to understand in other situations to which they apply. So I value moral intuition. But if you make a distinction, in this case, between a 2-week-old embryo and a 7-month fetus, if you make a distinction, but you cannot justify the distinction when pressed to provide reasons, there is an issue with that. Many cannot provide those justifications or provide those reasons. So when your stance is based merely on moral intuition, and it cannot be justified or defended via moral reasoning or natural law reasoning, it ought to be re-examined. So if you maintain these distinctions, for example, between an embryo in the uterus or an embryo outside the uterus, but you don't have any moral reasoning behind that initial moral intuition, I really think you need to re-examine that moral intuition or that conclusion you've made based on it. And I say this: moral intuition is a fine place to start. And I think we should start there. I think that's where why that faculty of moral intuition was given to us. It is a fine place to start, but it is a terrible place to finish. Moral intuition is a place to start, but we must always look for reasons and justifications, especially when it's leading to a distinction between life and death considerations. And finally, I want to say that there are two questions involved here. For example, with the distinction of the destruction of a 2-week-old embryo versus the abortion of a 7-month-old fetus. The first question involves deciding, is this particular act morally permissible? Is it morally permissible to purposely destroy a 2-week-old embryo? Is it morally permissible to kill a 7-month-old fetus? And here we're excluding the context where it may be needed to save the life of the mother in an ectopic pregnancy or preeclampsia or anything like that. So we're excluding those scenarios. So the question is, are they both morally impermissible? You say yes or no. And then you can decide what the proper penalty of doing these things is. So I could see that you would say, well, killing a 2-week-old embryo is morally impermissible, just like killing a 7-month-old fetus is morally impermissible based on their ontology of what they are, of human beings. But a second question about the penalty, let's say someone breaches that moral prohibition, what would be the proper penalty? Here, we could say that there might be a lesser penalty for the destruction of a 2-week embryo versus the penalty for aborting a 7-month-old fetus. That is a possibility. I'm not saying that that would be necessarily required. It's a very complex determination. You have to look at the natural law reasonings for both of those killings. And to me, the most important area that bears on the proper penalty for these two different acts is the mens rea of the person or persons involved in the taking of the life. What is the mens rea? What is the culpable mental state? And there are a lot of different ideas about mens rea. And we cannot get into all of those details here. I could make another video on that, where we examine all of the subtle nuances of mens rea. So again, make a comment down below and let me know if that's something you'd be interested in exploring further. So my final thoughts here after all of this time, hopefully going through in a programmatic, a systematic way, going through all of the issues involved with particularly in vitro fertilization, but more broadly, reproductive technologies. I have three final thoughts. Number one, reproductive technologies, including in vitro fertilization, can be utilized in a moral Christian manner that respects the sanctity of life. It seems that the authors and backers of the SBC resolution agree with this, although they don't take it very far. They say, and this is in Albert Mohler's white paper on his website, albertmohler.com, Christian couples must not embrace the new reproductive technologies without clear biblical and theological reflection. At a bare minimum, Christian couples must commit to the implantation of all embryos and the selective reduction of none. That's exactly what we did do. If you remember our conversation back in the principles and practices that we employed when we used reproductive technologies. What I don't understand is in this white paper or in the resolution itself, why this wasn't mentioned as a moral way to utilize these technologies. Biblical normativity of embodied union in human reproduction seems to speak to how it is or how it was, say, at the time of creation. In other words, it was descriptive, but it was not prescriptive, meaning it was not showing or explaining how it should always be. There was not a moral imperative in how human reproduction should occur. Divine providence and human free will agency are woven together without contradiction in some biblical frameworks, such as the one we looked at, middle knowledge, also known as Molinism. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you did find value in it. Like all good YouTube videos, I'm asking you to subscribe, set notifications, like, share, and comment, especially if you have any questions or any kind of clarifications you need on anything in this video. Put a comment below and I will be sure to answer it. Thank you.